answer period after each portion of the program. We will have a few minutes and try to cover as many questions as we can. Any questions that we don't cover, we will be putting out on our website. We're going to try to put them out there and provide answers, just in the interest of time. So our first presentation this morning is an overview of composting, and that will be presented by Will Lockwood, who is the brains behind this whole operation. He did all of our videos, and he also has this wonderful presentation that he does. And it's a great overview of composting. And then that will be followed with a video of Barry and his 3-bin system. So with that, I think we will take it away to you, Will.
All right, very good. Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Okay, I'm going to share my screen here and share. And I hope that is it. Can someone give me a verbal confirmation they're seeing correctly?
It looks great to me, Will.
Very good. Thank you. Then we'll get started. Well, thank you everybody for coming today. I'm going to talk a bit about compost and why Zero Waste Vashon feels it's important for our community. So this is compost. What is it? It is basically a natural process where bacteria decompose organic materials into humus. And humus is that dark organic material that forms in soil where plant and animal matter decays. You find it in the forest floor, and it's got this wonderful earthy smell to it. It's a natural process, and it is how nature recycles. And leaves, vegetable scraps, lawn clippings can all be turned into a rich amendment. So this is nature's way of recycling. Nature does it all the time. Nothing is wasted in nature. So we'll be talking mostly about aerobic composting today. There is another type, which is anaerobic, and that is in the absence of air. And that's what's being done by Island Springs Island Springs Tofu Factory. And they're less common in America, but you see them a lot in India and China, where they actually supply the local towns with gas for cooking and lighting, and it helps them deal with their waste. Both Seattle and Tacoma have sophisticated waste treatment centers that use anaerobic digestion to treat biosolids. And like I said, we now have a pilot project going on at Island Springs managed by Impact Bioenergy. But today we're going to talk about what you can do in your backyard, which is aerobic composting. So some examples of aerobic composting are your home compost bin, a yard waste pile. You can have larger commercial or community composting systems. And some anaerobic examples that you could do at home are bokashi, which is a Korean and Asian method of working using microbacteria to break down food substances. You could build your own anaerobic digester if you were so ambitious, but more commonly, many of us have worm bins. And it may seem odd to put the worm bin here, but essentially the bacteria in the worm's gut is an anaerobic digester. So this is a very simple process. It's familiar to most people. It can be done at home or commercially. The principles are essentially the same. And we've recently had a recommendation for those that are looking for some background material for this book that's available out of the library. It's called Easy Compost. You can also order from your local booksellers, and it sells for about $13, I think $12.95. So let's talk a bit about residential aerobic composting. And if you're interested, we've got on our website um, a quick guide to home composting system with lots and lots of links that should help you get started if you haven't done this before, or if you're curious about other methods. So the first system that is familiar to many people is the 3-bin system, and there's all different ways you can put it together. After my presentation today, we'll be having Barry Foster talk about his 3-bin system. The advantage of this process, a 3-bin system, is greater production capacity, where you can have one bin starting, another cooking and processing, and the third one finishing, ready for use. Many people on island do another method, and that's a 1-bin system, or sometimes just a simple static pile. And in 2 weeks, we'll be seeing examples of this process. The advantage here is that it's simpler, though it's slower, but it's good for annual or biannual batch production. And then another system yet are the tumbler style composter, which is a closed container in which you put the raw ingredients into it, and then by tumbling it, you stir and aerate the pile inside the tumbler. And used as a batch system, it can produce compost in as little as 6 weeks. Or you can use it as an add-as-you-go system, and that works also well. It's just a slower process. The nice thing with a 2-chamber system is that you can have one that is being added to, and the other one that is essentially composting and not added to. Now, conversely, worm gins are a container that provides a good environment for red wiggler worms to process the organics. And they break down things into a compost of high fertility. And this particular one you see here has got 2 bays, which is a really interesting and clever system, so that, again, you can have one batch working, and then when you want it to compost and you want the worms to go over to the other side, you start putting the food and substance on the other side, and after a little bit, you can start robbing the compost because the worms have already migrated to the other side. So on a little larger scale, you can have community composting, and it's the same principle as backyard composting, but on a larger production level. And this is really handy for pea patches or when you need to make a lot more composting. I visited Midnight Farm up in Lopez Island, where he is doing a marvelous system, and essentially the composting facility for Lopez Island. And it's not a giant commercial facility. It's very hands-on, and it's run by one guy. Commercial aerobic composting can be also of all different scales to very large, but also to more modest scales. At the bottom, the composting piles that are covered with truck tarps are what are being used in Kingston. And it's a sort of an in-between size thing that is very productive and serving a large part of Kitsap County. So how is compost made? Well, it requires some essential ingredients. It needs carbon for energy. It needs nitrogen, which you'll find in things like grass clippings, or fruits and vegetables. It needs oxygen to oxidize the carbon and accelerate the decomposition process. And then it needs water to maintain the activity without going anaerobic, which would happen if you had too much water. And it's essentially a recipe. Using the brown items, which are the carbon suppliers, and green items, which are the nitrogen suppliers, and then air, which is supplied by you as stirring the pile or with aeration into the pile, and water. And the general recipe is to mix 2 parts green with 1 part brown, but it's not sacrosanct. There are people on island that are doing different blends, either 1-to-1 or 3-to-1. And they seem to work. So this is just a general guide. It's hard to get perfect, so don't worry if you just can't get it exactly right. Some brown sources are dried leaves, sawdust, wood chips, straw, and green sources are in your kitchen scraps, stuff you collect out of your garden, grass clippings, etc. And now is a great time as you're putting your gardens to sleep to really build up on the greens and then complement them with leaves that are falling in your yard. So, and again, this is a general rule, but try to avoid oily substances. Definitely avoid pet droppings. There's too many contagions that you don't want to pass on to humans. And animal products should be avoided unless you have a good protection and screening against rats and other things getting in there. And your system either has a high enough temperature to break these products down, or in some cases, worm bins will also break them down. So the benefits of compost are so many that I ran out of room to put it on this list here. Compost is amazing for improving all types of soil. A good compost will be rich in humus, macro and micronutrients, and microbiota. And this inoculates the soil as well as enhancing its structure. Vashon soils are basically glacial till. So whether it is your soil is sandy or clay-based, they all benefit from compost. The big question commonly is how much do I add to it? And this will vary. If you're doing it for feeding your lawn, you don't want to put too much on it. You could actually have problems if you do. So about a 1/4 inch is fine. But in the home garden, you have some that you almost can't give enough compost to, and some plants and others not. So testing is a really good way to figure this out. And King County has a free testing soil program. I think you get 5 free tests through King County Conservation. And there's the link for that. And there's also a calculator for figuring out how much to add to your garden. And both these links are on our website, but I put them up here for you to see. But for home garden that is starting out with undisturbed soil, a good rule of thumb is about a cubic foot for every 20 square feet. If the soil is just basically sand, then you may have to go as much as 1 foot of compost for every 2 cubic feet of soil being used. And testing is the best way to figure this out. So Zero Waste Vashon wants to see a composting facility built on Vashon Island. We started this project called Waste to Garden to explore how compost and amendments would work on our native soils. This is a description of the project. We wanted to explore how various amendments would work on our soils, but we also wanted to do a scientific test to compare with compost and with biochar as an amendment versus not having it. So part of this project explored the different amendments, which were most of which were resources, waste resources that could be turned into things. And one of the things that's very familiar to most people on the island is okara coming from the tofu factory. So we tried that amongst others. And we grew a variety of plants. We did soil testing and measurements were done at the beginning and the end of each year on a per plot basis. The soil health was lab tested, and then we measured at the end of the season the per plot yield. This was located behind the IGA. The garden was 2,400 square feet. The soil we started out was disastrous. It's all fill that was brought in there and dumped in. So we were actually about 18 inches above the native soil that was there way back from when it was farmed around turn of the century. It was extremely acidic and low in nutrients, but quite high in trace minerals. And due to its clay nature, clay is basically ground up rock. And And that is probably why our soils actually have a fairly good mineral content. When I tested it, and this is one of the advantages of the testing, I found out that the soil was very, very high in magnesium. Had I added dolomite lime, which was my initial reaction to it, which is 50% magnesium carbonate, I could have turned the soil toxic. This is the value of soil testing. It's cheap and it provides a good baseline before amending. So instead of adding dolomite lime, I added agricultural lime, calcium carbonate, and that was a safe additive. We added bone meal to bring up the phosphorus levels, again, baseline test. And then initially for that 2,400 square feet, we added 7 cubic yards of compost that first year. The second year, we added 5 more cubic yards. The compost was added on the first year to all the beds, the entire system, because the soil was so disastrously lacking in carbon and such incredibly bad quality. We found everything from bricks to exhaust pipes in there. It was just fill dirt. So then we set up the garden, divided it into 9 rows. 6 were for the biochar testing and 3 were for the amendment testing. This is how this test was set up. And we did blocks of 4, repeating blocks of 4 with none, the nitrogen fertilizer, a biochar, and then the biochar plus the nitrogen fertilizer. Now, nitrogen is exhaust quickly. It doesn't stay in the soil. So that's typically an annual amendment that one would have to do. In the last 3 rows, which we were testing just for, mostly for the amendments, we planted onions the first year, and we grabbed waste source amendments to put into the pair blocks, one with biochar or one without it. And we also then added a commercial organic fertilizer, which was down to earth, to try out that as a control in addition to having nothing added. And this is the way it was laid out. Again, all of this is up on our website, so I won't dwell too hard on it. And this is what it looked like. And starting out, it looked like a nice orderly garden. You can see the color tags, which are color coded to this layout chart for identification. And then we planted, we waited. But just to show you, we dug a sample up 1 month later to see what the difference was. And that is just after 1 month. The difference was astounding even at that point. And it really became apparent. This was taken in July, and much to our surprise, the garden was doing well in the first year in spite of starting out with very poor dirt. I actually had no expectation of having a good crop the first year, and here it was thriving. And to show just an example of results, it was nothing but spectacular. The first year, from this poor fill dirt, we harvested 305 pounds of potatoes, 135 pounds of green beans, and 195 pounds of onions. And each year, the yield increased. Overall, this project created about 2,000 pounds or a ton of organic produce for the food bank. And this is just a visual example showing the difference between the non-amended and the amended soil. A day and night difference. Again, test your soil and feed the soil and you will get results. The soil is essentially a biological system. And we're learning to that taking care of the soil is perhaps more important than taking care of the plant. In a healthy, balanced soil filled with micronutrients, a plant stands a much better chance of becoming a strong, bug-resistant, and disease-free. Zero Waste Vashon's goal is to dramatically reduce the waste going off island to the King County landfill. A key component of our work is finding ways to convert island waste into a resource. Vashon's largest export is garbage. Organic waste is compostable. So why send it off island when this can be turned into a valuable resource? To tackle this issue, Zero Waste Vashon is focused first on yard waste. Eventually, other non-consumer waste, coffee ground, chaff, spent brewery grains can be added. But we started with King County on getting the yard waste program employed. It's been a huge success, far exceeding what King County expected. Essentially, what we're trying to do is break the mold of a linear economy, where materials are taken from the earth, used, and then disposed. Producer responsibility is key to making this work. This is called cradle to grave, or more ideally, cradle to cradle responsibility. If you take something from the planet, you are responsible for the product once its usefulness is done. We need to mimic nature. Nature wastes nothing. Now, can this model work? Well, the European Union adopted this plan more than 2 decades ago. They continue to refine and develop more solutions on the road to a circular economy. But this is just one dramatic example. In the 1970s, Germany had around 50,000 landfills. Now, in a country of 83 million people, there are less than 300 landfills, and you have to have a permit to take something to the landfill. Essentially, here's the issue. Essential growth inside of a finite system leads to collapse. This is what we're facing. We can and we have to do better. It's up to us, and we can't expect to happen top down. We need to start at the community level and work outward to set an example that this is a successful and fruitful undertaking. There are other steps that can be taken, like eliminating single-use plastics, which I just heard that Canada will be doing as of January. But we can also advocate for reduced packaging and support a more local food supply chain. Composting fits in with this. It's amazing for improving all types of soil. A good compost will be rich in humus, macro and micronutrients, and microbiota. It inoculates the soil as well as enhancing its structure. And it's actually, if you'll see from these videos coming up, it's fun. So King County Solid Waste Division is now working with Zero Waste Vashon and HDR, a firm that is studying the small-scale organics management options for the Vashon-Maury Island community. This study will demonstrate the cost and benefits of an on-island compost processing facility by considering current and forecasted feedstock sources, potential processing technologies, options for facility operation, and expected markets for finished products. The initial study is solely to determine the project viability and does not include facility siting or construction. The study results will help determine whether King County Solid Waste Division pursues the next steps on this project. So, just a friendly reminder, this is the only home we have. Let's treat it kindly. And that's the end of my presentation.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Will. That is a great overview, and you covered a lot of ground. we are going to take questions, I think, at this point that Tom has been compiling for us. So Tom, are you ready to?
Yes, we have one question.
Okay.
You can then decide if you want to take some ad hoc questions at the very end, but we have one question from Sharon, which is a specific point or number that you wanted to have repeated from the PowerPoint. And that is to know how much compost is needed for garden beds in general and specifically for a garden bed with tomatoes. It was a number that was up there, flashed by. She was wondering if she could see what those numbers are again.
I can go back to that slide and try to post it, but it is really going to vary. You know, an existing garden that is mature is probably going to have a fairly high carbon level in it, and it may only need, you know, a cubic foot or two for 30 or 40 square feet of garden. That's a possibility. But when one is starting out fresh, then it's a very different situation. So when we started out with the Waste Garden Project, we had soil that was extremely low in carbon. It was testing at about 5% carbon, 4.5. And we wanted to bring it up to a much higher level, and we brought it up to about 8% carbon by the time the project was done. My local home garden is testing more around 10% carbon. So it's hard to give too much compost if it's a nice, good quality compost. So really, it's going to depend on how much you have. And I urge one to use the Green Mountain compost calculator. That is, I think I passed along those links to our moderators, and if that could be posted in the chat, that would be helpful for them to see.
Okay, you did have a specific number up there for tomatoes. I'm speaking for Sharon. She could add something if she wants. So
Yeah,
imagining that one has a garden bed that's established and one wants to grow tomatoes, it would be helpful, I think, for her to find out now or later what the numbers were that were posted in that one slide where tomatoes were specified. So
yeah, the slide that is where tomatoes are specified just simply says tomatoes love compost. so you know, Sharon, can you let us know what size bed you have, and then maybe I can give you an idea? Your tomato bed.
What I'm going to suggest here is, if you have a very specific question to your own situation, send an email through the chat, and we will get back to you more individually, because we do need to keep track of our time, and keep our, you know, our answers fairly short. So if you can send across an email, and then maybe, Will, you could continue this offline at some point.
Yeah, and additionally, if you have questions at any time, even later, you can email info@zerowastevashon.org.
Yeah.
So Nancy, I have a combined question to ask, the combination of questions from Michael and Stephanie. How do you actually test your soil, Will? And what's the recommended time for testing before and after the growing season?
That's a very good question. I like testing in fall because particularly if the goal is to get your amendments in and working so they're ready for spring planting. The testing instructions are on King County's website, but generally what you do, you have a choice of either just one bed testing, but if you have multiple beds, you may want to take a scoop of each, and then you dry them out so that they're not soaking wet, but you don't heat dry them. You just let them naturally air dry out. And then you put them into baggies, and King County says, or the lab will tell you how much they want. So I use Ziploc baggies for them, and probably had the bag about half full for each sample. I like fall testing because that allows me to get preparations done early, usually in January, so that my soil is ready in springtime by April for planting.
And I think one more point on that question was how to get the test, I think. And Will did provide a link during the presentation, but if you missed that, we will put all of those links on our website.
Yeah, and they can be posted into the chat too.
Do you have that handy to post into the
yes,
chat?
I actually handed them over to the team so someone can post them in the chat.
All right, I'm not going to attempt to do that, or I might disconnect the whole meeting. Perhaps one of our other team members could pull up that email and post that. I did turn off screen sharing briefly. There was somebody who was sharing a screen. I would request that participants not share an additional screen at this point, because that could be a little distracting. But I will turn on the screen sharing now to see if somebody can post that. The link to the county. Anybody got that?
Yeah, I can do that while the next video is playing.
Okay, put it into the chat room.
Yes.
Okay, all right, that's better. So moving along, if we don't have other questions, Tom, we're good on that?
No, that was the last one.
Okay, all right. Well, it was a pretty thorough presentation. So our next segment is a video of Barry Foster and his 3-bin composting system, which he's been doing for several years. And it feeds their beautiful garden. So I'm going to pass it over to Will. And after that presentation, we will have Barry on live to answer questions. So here we go. So Will, you're putting that video on, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
And do you see it now?
I do not. Meeting settings, screen, I got screen sharing on, but I don't see video.
Yeah, I'm trying to share it and it's not letting me share it.
That worked last night on our trial run. So
let me kill PowerPoint. Maybe that is stealing everything. Yeah, because I am trying. There we go.
Oh,
there we go.
Here we go.
That was a problem. Okay, very good. And here we roll.
Okay, so here we are at the home of Barry and Bruce. Barry Foster has been kind enough to give us a demonstration of a 3-bin composting system. And they've been doing it for how many years now?
We've been doing it about 13 or 14 years.
13 or 14 years. And later on, we'll give a little bit of a tour of some of the evidence of how effective this compost has been. We can see in front of us here a 3-bin system. What's the basic process that you have here for making compost?
What we do with this system is I start fresh compost here, and I try to fill a whole bin at once so that I can get enough mass to create the heat that's kind of insulated around the sides and can build up a combustion. So I fill it up to about here, really, and we have chickens, we use that, we use lawn clippings, leaves, I use some soil as kind of in between the layers to get some microbes going into the soil. I do moisten the layers as I go along. Anyway, then once it's filled, I've been putting this black weed cloth on to kind of hold in the moisture and to do a little sun heating. And then I've held it in place with these upside down plant flats. And I can moisten this whole bin right through this whole thing. I just spray it and it seeps down in. Once that, our experience in the summer is that this reaches about 140 degrees in about 4 or 5 days. And I let it burn until it's cooled off a little bit. And then I transfer it into the next bin. So it helps mix it up as I move over here. I make sure the moisture is sufficient. The second bin sits, again, it's got the same system with the black plastic on top. And it sits, I'm sort of lazy about it. It sits until I'm ready to turn it, really, or until the next batch is ready. And then it goes into the finishing pile. Normally we accumulate compost in the finished pile all year long and use it mostly in the spring. Although I definitely will dip out of that as well. So that's kind of the basic process of what we do here.
Does the system stay active or working through the winter?
It does work in the winter. It's much slower, but actually I've never really started a new bin in the winter. But if I do one in the late fall with all the leaves and grass that started to grow again, it's ready to be turned over to the next pile within, I don't know, a month or 6 weeks. So it does work. It's just much slower. And, I'm slower in the winter too. I don't get out it.
We all are.
It seems to be fine at sits too. Yeah, we use it year round.
And what is your source of brown material? Because that's always been a challenge for me, particularly in the summer, to get enough brown.
We have straw in the chicken coop, which comes in with chicken droppings. But I also in the fall will collect leaves, and I usually have a big pile of leaves off to the end. And a lot of the leaves have been run over by the lawnmower, so they're already starting to decompose. And I'll just feather those in as I need them. But I have a giant pile of leaves and crushed leaves down there that I use. So that's what I do.
Yeah, that's very good. And do you add anything additional, any azomite or any other special minerals?
I have not added anything at all.
Okay.
One thing I didn't mention here is that this is where any kitchen waste goes as well. Garden trimmings, most even weeds can go in here as long as they don't have seeds that are mature. And as this perks along, I'll even uncover it, dig a hole, put new kitchen waste in it. So that's going on all the time. So it's not the whole batch exactly synchronous, but good enough. By the time it ends up over there, you can't tell that there's anything. But no, I've never added any sort of other mineral or anything. Yeah, we just sort of are doing this by the seat of our pants and a little internet research. And
well, it certainly seems effective. Yeah, and you've talked about the wetting silence. So how do you know when it's moist enough? How do you know when the moisture?
Well, every once in a while I'll dig into it and just see how far the moisture goes down. This one's pretty easy to tell because I know that recently it's all been moistened down as I've filled it, and it only is in here in the summer 3 weeks or so. As I turn it over here, I can kind of gauge and see if it needs any more moisture. And then once it's in these 2 bins, I can kind of check on moisture levels because these get full of worms. So I've gotten worm castings as well out of this. It's an unintentional worm bed, maybe. And if the worms are active, I know that I've got enough moisture.
Sure. That's also a good nutrient source. Yeah. They're nature's anaerobic digesters.
Yeah.
And so roughly, how long does it take through the whole process to come up with usable compost?
In the height of the summer, I can get usable compost in about 6 weeks.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
It might not be, as fully broken down. I might still see some leaf or little twig things at the very end, but if I need to, I do have a little sifter over here, I think, that I, is it here?
Oh, yeah.
So I do sift some compost for some things. So if I'm using it quickly, I'll definitely sift it. Otherwise, a lot of our use, I don't really need to bother with that at all.
So I want to go over and show a little bit of how you're using the compost. But you have an example of a compost that's finished? You might be able to see? Take a look at it.
This one is pretty much done. Yeah.
I feel you should still see little bits of the leaf mold and everything.
Yeah, things in here. There's a little bit of leaf and
Good stuff. Hard to smell through a mask, but it smells great. Very nice. So it holds its shape when moist, but it's not dripping wet. Yeah, it looks good. Probably a lot of humus in there too.
there is, yeah. And I mentioned off camera, but this piece of land that we're on really is dirty sand. So
Yeah. And let's take a look at that. I'm going to hold this just pause for a minute so we can actually look at the soil and then also look at what you've done with it. So what is interesting to me about your gardening technique, this is not a row by row formal organizing. It's much more organic, kind of flowing and spread. But if we can look down here, we can see that what you're farming in is sand. And yet there are thriving squash, thriving tomatoes. The tomatoes are interesting because it really dramatically illustrates how you've gone from sand to the compost enriched soil. The darker, it's very obvious visual. And how beautiful these tomatoes look. I was guessing that is somewhere pushing towards almost 7 foot, 8 foot tall. And they are thriving, they're happy, and yet just inches away from their roots, it looks to me like these are about 18-inch, 2-foot diameter circles, is just sand, like beach sand.
yeah. So what I've done here is just dig pits about 2.5 feet deep and 2 feet wide or so, and this ring of sand that's around it is some of the soil that was dug out. I make a little kind of moat, fill this with compost. Sometimes I mix a little bit of that sand back in, make sure I have good drainage, and then I can just water these sort of moat surrounded pits. The water stays here with the compost, and that way I have a little island of good soil in this sand.
Well, it certainly works. This is a testimony to a successful gardening and gardening technique. All sorts of stuff growing in the sandbank with the help of compost.
Yeah. Nancy, you're muted.
Sorry. That was wonderful, and we really thank Barry for bringing us into his home and demonstrating his system for us. I'm going to bring Barry online now, and let's see. All right, going to unmute you, Barry. Barry says he has birds that are a bit noisy, so I kept him muted during the proceeds. There we go. And Barry, I think you have to unmute yourself now that I sent that request.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
I'm unmuted.
All right, there you are. So, Tom, have we gotten some questions during the video that we could pose to Barry and or Will? Tom?
Yes, there are a couple of questions. I think, Barry, you can see the chat. Do you want to address those questions by repeating them and then answering them, or do you want me to speak them out loud to Nancy and have them?
Let's see. Oh, here, over here.
We've accumulated two specific questions from the video.
I don't see them here, so maybe you could read them
Okay.
to me, if you don't mind.
Fine. So one question had been posed and answered by Will is that's whether brown paper, newspaper, or plain cardboard was appropriate, and Will answered that all of them are okay. The two unanswered questions are, first, do you use straw to insulate the outer edges of your bin? And then Jeannie asked, what are the specific dimensions of each of the compost bins?
Okay, great. I see those now. I don't use straw to insulate the outside, only because I never heard of that as an idea, I guess. And I really am trying to do as simple as possible. So it's just easier for me to layer up brown, green, chicken waste, yard waste, kitchen compost, rather than trying to go around the edges. So no, I don't do that. And I see the bins questions. They're about 3.5 feet cubed, 3 to 4 feet, something like that. We had read on the internet that 3 feet was kind of the ideal minimum to be able to build enough mass so that the heat can get going. And so that was kind of our standard. I see a question
Since I
about,
think you can see the chat. Okay.
yeah, I can see these questions coming in now. How do I keep the raw material from while we're waiting for enough to fill the first bin? Well, as I mentioned, I've got a pile of leaves from the previous fall that are kind of my brown materials on standby. Straw in the chicken coop can just sit there while it's waiting. Green material is a little trickier. I do quite a bit of lawn mowing out on the verges of the street in front of us, so I can get quite a bit of green at one time. So as I said in the video, my goal is to kind of fill a bin all at once. That's pretty ambitious. We have an acre that we garden here, so I do have access to a lot of green. Maybe somebody else could speak to how to store, especially green material. There was a question about arsenic in soils. We had our soil tested when the county was doing arsenic testing, and found very, very low levels of it. So it's not a concern to me. I wouldn't have any concern myself about putting old potting soil into a bin. I only buy organic stuff when I've had to buy it for starting seeds and such. And we also are surrounded by maple trees, big leaf maple. I do mow a little bit around the yard here, as well as out on the street and the edges of the street. And so some of the leaves get chopped, but I also have just a big pile of leaves, of miscellaneous leaves, big maple, oak, live oak, alder, and they just sit in another pile, and eventually they break down, and then they're ready. And even as they're not completely broken down, they just get feathered in with when I'm making new compost piles. So it's not necessary to chop up the leaves. When I add a layer of leaves, I make sure it's not too thick so that it doesn't get matted down and nothing else can join it. So I try to do layers of about 3 or 4 inches of each type of material.
And then Barry, you also, you cut in kitchen waste scraps, et cetera, into the piles?
I do. Whenever we have those, when I'm putting together a compost pile, I put whatever kitchen waste I do have, and then while it's cooking, I accumulate more kitchen waste, I'll just dig a hole in the top of the pile, dump it in, and cover it back up. And so the compost pile that I do is not exactly all done at one time, but by the time it moves over to that middle bin, it's got plenty of time to kind of everything catch up with it. So I just don't run into any sort of trouble with late additions.
So Barry, as far as timing, once you've added that last batch of kitchen waste, how long would you recommend letting it sit before you move it over to your next pile? Just to...
For me, it really depends on the time of year because of the ambient heat. Summertime, if I'm on top of it, I can easily move it over to the next bin within 3 weeks. My sort of measure of that is, right away it will heat up as it starts to compost. And then within a couple weeks, it's starting to cool down again. And I just figure that's the time that it needs to be turned for more air and aging. So 3 weeks in the summer. And I think I mentioned that, maybe I have let it sit as long as 6 weeks in the winter before I'm ready to move it over. The whole process works more slowly in the winter when the ambient temperature is a lot lower.
Right. Okay. Looks like we've gotten a couple more questions.
2 or 3 more questions that have just come in.
Yeah, I see those. One is, are the piles invaded by roots from below? The bins that I have are underneath some medium-sized fir trees. I do get a little root action, but it's never been enough of a problem for me to do anything about it. I thought, well, I guess you could put weed cloth down underneath it, but then for me, the whole thing is about simplicity. Digging, when I go to move the pile, then I have to be careful to not dig through that cloth. So I guess I haven't felt the big need to do it because I haven't had that situation arise.
Right, that's a variable. We have horrible root invasion. So this year, for the first time, I'm trying some plastic down on the ground, and some other people have indicated that works successfully. It just depends, I think, on one situation and what species of trees are around. We have a redwood that is very, very invasive.
Yeah.
So I think
I cut out a little bit, but did we get to the peat moss question and the sawdust question?
Yeah, we have some brown questions, and so to answer the sawdust, the types that are not good to use would be cedar or walnut sawdust. Walnut sawdust is toxic, and the cedar, it will inhibit growth. Other than that, most local sawdust, alder is excellent, but you could, even if it was Doug fir or hemlock or maple, that would be also okay. Try to avoid cedar or walnut in that. And there's let's see what else is in here. We're getting a lot all of a sudden.
yeah, it's great. We've got one.
I see a question here about the black weed cloth. For me, it's something that I've just started doing in the last couple of years because we did some paths and used that as a base to keep weeds down. And I just sort of had the idea that with the extra, I could put it on top of the compost piles to help keep the moisture in, as well as to sort of solar heat them to keep them fired up. I did it for years and years and years without weed cloth on top, and it worked just fine as well. I had to be a little more conscious of the water, keeping it moist enough. I've never covered the bins. I've seen some systems that have some of that clear plastic corrugated material on top, which sort of would serve the purpose. I just didn't want to look at that. I didn't want to go out and buy it. So yeah, definitely the weed cloth is not necessary.
So I can answer the question about peat moss. I would prefer not to use peat moss. It is a natural product that actually is better to stay in place. But an alternative is coir. That's spelled C-O-I-R. That's made from coconut husks and like that, and that's very viable. It's a good brown that you can add, and you can get that in bricks and then kind of break it apart and use that if you need a source of brown.
And I should add that there are some environmental negatives to peat moss that have been discovered over the years. The destruction of the peat beds, it's turning out to cause a lot of problems, whereas the coconut coir is similar and doesn't have those negative environmental impacts.
Right.
So.
Did we pick up the question from Debbie Jackson on the 5-gallon buckets and also the one from Lavinia on bins in full sun, shade, or whatever?
We have not done those.
And that's actually a very good question. In general, most of the bin systems and everything I've seen are not in full sun, but I don't think it really hurts. What is probably more destructive in fall in your overwintering bin is if they are uncovered, that the rain can really leach out and hammer through a pile. So a cover at that point, even if it's landscape fabric or something like that, helps reduce the impact of heavy rain.
Which question was that?
Does it matter?
Oh.
Yeah, at the bottom.
Oh, okay. There's another bin question further up between the root question and the black weed cloth question about buckets in
Right.
rows.
Debbie Jackson, I think, is looking for, yes, so maybe we could answer it this way. How absolutely necessary is brown matter to mix in with compost? I think that's essentially what Debbie's asking here.
Yeah, and what Debbie is doing by putting it in the garden there and trenches in the garden, it will eventually break down, but it's going to be a much slower process, because essentially if the soil had a lot of worms in it, it would sort of act like a worm bin. But you also have the problem of vermin going in and digging stuff up. I've had raccoon go in and dig it up when I was doing bokashi. So it helps to, at least if you're going to have veggies that way, to have them broken down a bit in advance. The bokashi system does that, and so it accelerates. It has microorganisms breaking down the items. But other than that, yeah, you want to pre-compost them at least 50% before turning them into a garden bed.
All right. I don't see any other questions. Does anybody want to add anything before we wrap up? We're a little bit early, but that's probably not a bad thing. So
I was going to mention one thing, Nancy. When Will and I were talking back by our compost system, I talked a little bit about some of the green material that I get from the garden. I'm really conscious about not putting any kind of a root in there that's viable, like especially morning glory. But I use a lot of leafy weeds, shotweed, dandelion, and sometimes I'll just chop off the green part and throw the roots back. We have an acre behind our cultivated garden that is just sort of neglected, and I put bigger yard waste back there, stems and branches and, you know, even extra leaves and stuff like that. So any of the weird invasive roots go back there instead of into the compost pile. But lots of weed greens do get into my compost pile, and it's just a great source of green as long as the seeds aren't viable or won't send out roots from the stems like morning glories do.
This is also a good reason to not use chemicals on your garden, because if you're going to be taking these plants later on and putting them into your compost, you want to be very careful about anything that's going to be persistent and staying into the garden. And there's one other thing I should mention to this, and that is manures. So chicken manures, if the chickens aren't on antibiotics or anything, are fine. Goat, rabbit manures are fine. Llama manure is fine. But unfortunately, most horse manure is not fine. And the reason for this is not the horse manure, it is the fact of the hay that they eat. The hay, if it comes from Eastern Washington, is treated with clopyralid. And clopyralid is a very persistent herbicide that will stay. The horse manure actually concentrates the clopyralid and will stay persistent in your garden for 3 to 5 years. And that will mean that no bean or pea crop can grow there for 3 to 5 years. And other crops will struggle at best. So unfortunately, horses that eat Eastern Washington hay create a manure that we cannot use.
That's a good point, Will. Thank you for mentioning that. Um, Barry, can you talk about when you put your lawn trimmings in, do you worry about the seeds from the grass or from any weeds in your lawn?
I've never had an issue with that, Nancy, because when the grass is growing, I mow it every week in the summer. We don't have a lot of lawn ourselves, but we kind of trim up the grassy verges on the road. But it's trimmed enough that it's often enough that the seeds either haven't formed yet or aren't ripe. So actually, when I've been composting, I just have never had any sort of weed seed problem. The compost gets up, honestly, to 140 or so degrees. That seems to kill whatever might get in there. And I am sort of conscious, like you mentioned, about putting any kind of seed in there. So I wouldn't run over probably a dry grass field with the lawnmower and put that in. I'd be careful about that anyway. I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
It looks like we have a few more questions that have come in. Tom, do you want to?
Yeah, so first question I think is actually to Carrie to find out if Will's discussion of horse manure addresses her question about straw needing to be sourced. And then we clear that one. If we do, then we have a couple of questions coming in towards the end that are sort of follow-ups on what Will
Yeah,
said.
I mean, that's a good question. And we will have next session, Ken Miller will be on, and he can talk. He does use straw, and he can talk about the sourcing of it. I've only used straw once, and this may be my own peculiar experience. It was from Island Lumber, and it's nice compacted bales. And I used it at the Waste to Garden project for in between the straw row mulch. It was a wonderful mulch, except the straw was packed with oat seed. And literally, it was as if I was, and I put it quite deep, but literally I would have to mow down with a weed eater every week the oat that kept on growing up through the straw. So caveat emptor, but Ken can talk a lot more about that because he uses straw in his system and he's had fairly good success and it's not been a problem. So just something you need to worry. If you have a good compost pile that really gets hot, it will kill off most seeds, and Ken's gets pretty hot, so that may be why it works for him.
All right, thank you.
Okay, I see that Jeremy had posted a question. I'm speaking these in case not everybody's looking at a chat stream here, but Jeremy had posted a question about steer manure and how appropriate that is. Will had answered that it's fine if it's commercial. If it's local, then we're back to the issue of what the cattle have been eating. We also then have a question from Jeannie about how sunny a location has to be to put the compost bins.
I don't think sun is a big factor in it. If it's in a really hot, sunny location, the thing you will have to watch out for is moisture content and drying out. So, covering it will help, but it may tend to dry out faster. But I've seen compost bins in sun, and I've seen them not in sun. So I don't think that's, I wouldn't make that a prerequisite for citing a compost bin.
And we have a question from Stephanie about the ideal turning frequency, the turning over of the compost.
I'll leave that to Barry.
Well, we don't do any turning other than putting it from one bin into the other. I don't spade it around. So when I fill up that first compost bin with new material, it sits there for 3 weeks before it, a minimum of 3 weeks before it gets turned over into the next bin. And it can sit in that middle bin for a few months before, sometimes before I really get around to moving it. And it seems to still continue to do its work. I think I could probably be a little faster with it. But I don't know, between age and laziness and decreasing need for the compost I'm making, what I do seems to work just fine. So I'm definitely not out there turning it often.
Do we have any other last final questions? I don't see anything coming across. If not, I will wrap things up here with a couple of points. In 2 weeks, on November 7th at 10 in the morning, we will have our next workshop, and we will be covering static pile systems, and we have a few examples of that, of your neighbors who are doing that, and we will have a similar question and answer period, so you'll have time to ask more questions. Please do go to our website to look for additional resources. We've got links to sites we've mentioned, we've got book listings, we've got more descriptions on how to do these various methods, so that can be really helpful. You know, we're really excited at Zero Waste Fashion to see all of our organic material that we create here on the island be made into something useful, to be made into compost, to feed our soils, and then to create wonderful food or beautiful flowers out of that. And so backyard composting is a great way to do that. And we're really trying to encourage that. We have an active compost committee at Zero Waste Fashion. So if compost is your thing and you would like to participate in that, please also contact us through info@zerowastefashion.org, or .org, not a .com. Contact us if you would like to be involved. We have a lot of things going on, and we welcome and encourage community participation. So if that's it, I will thank Barry very much for letting us video him, and I will thank Will for all of his hard work on this. And please tell friends and neighbors, and join us again in 2 weeks. Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.